Having ensured that every control has a name, we can then think about the start-in values, start-in attributes that we need to give each of the controls. So one thing I'll do is just to make all of my labels bold. So I'm going to hold down the Control key, click on each one, and then just go into the font property and switch on bold. And font, on second thoughts, would look better in regular. We can also think about setting a default font and a default size, and think about whether we want bold to be a default, italic to be a default, and also which of these sizes we might like as a default. So let's start with the fonts. Let's say we have Impact as our title and Times New Roman as our author default. We simply select the combo box, go down to the value property, and actually enter the font name in there. So Impact in this one, and Times New Roman in this one. Then for the size, let's say we're going to have a default of 30 for the title and 16 for the author. And let's say we're going to have Times New Roman bold, so we want bold to be switched on by default. To do that, we simply change the value from false to true. Now logically, having set these font attributes, the text that anyone types in here should match those attributes. So we can now select each of those text boxes, go into font, and just choose the same size. So we said 30, and the same font, we said Impact. And then here, we said 16, and Times New Roman, and bold. So let's just save our changes and test that this works. And this looks like Impact. And that looks like Times New Roman bold. Another thing we'll need to do is to make this text box multi-line. Although we've made it 2 lines high, as we type, you'll see it doesn't actually go on to 2 lines. And the attribute that will make that happen is to switch on multi-line. Make sure I'm on the right control first. And multi-line becomes true. And the difference is, if I now type, it will just wrap onto 2 lines automatically. We should also lock these 2 controls, so the user is unable to type their font size. They actually have to use the spin buttons. So I can click on this one, control click on that, and lock them simultaneously by simply putting locked to true. So when I run, you'll see I can't actually type the value in there. So now the spin buttons, if you highlight a spin button, the 3 most important, or the 3 key attributes, are going to be max, min, and small change. Max and min are self-explanatory, and the small change is really just the change, how much the value changes each time you click the up or down arrow. So we want to have increments of 0.5, and the change has to be an integer. So the trick is you simply multiply the value that you want by 10, and then when you read the value from the spin button to your text box, you then divide it by 10. And you set, in our case, you set the small change value to 5. So we've said the title is in the range 24 point to 36, so that's going to be 240, and the max is going to be 360. then the small change is going to be 5. And when we read the value, when we come to coding in the next video, when we read the value from the spin button into the text box, we simply divide the current value by 5. The final thing we need to do is to make sure that the start-in value of the spin button matches that of the text box. So we just go down to value and we set that to 30. Or rather 300. I forgot about the multiplying by 10, so 300. Let's then do this one. So let's do the value first. 160. No, we can't do the value first because obviously we have the default min and max in place. So let's do those first. Max 240, min 140, and now we can do value 160. Okay, the final thing we'll need to do is to set up these fellas. And when you're working with radio buttons or option buttons as they're called in VBA, two things to bear in mind. First, do you want to set a default value? So let's say in our case we want 5 by 8 to be the default. So we'll just switch on value true, and that selects the radio button, and they can obviously leave it as the default or change it to one of the other three. The second thing you'll need to do is to give all the radio buttons a group name, and that makes them behave as a group. On this occasion we'll get away with it because the only radio buttons on the form are all related. But if we were to introduce something else, for example, let's just click here and do print. So this is no longer a size, this is something else. And let's control drag that and make it ebook. When we test it, if I click on print, you'll see that my book size is now deselected. So all of these are behaving as one group because they all have the same default group name of blank. In other words, no group name at all. So the way around that is you select the whole set of radio buttons or option buttons that are related, and you give them a common group name. So these can now be called book size, and these temporary ones that I put in there, let's just call them medium. So now, because they've got different group names, when I test them, these four behave as a group, and these two behave as a completely separate group. Okay, so we can now get rid of our two temporary radio buttons, and hopefully that's given you a flavor of how you work with user forms and how you create the various controls. Obviously we haven't covered everything that user forms can do, but we will create other user forms during the course of these tutorials. So for the moment, let's save our changes, and in the next video we'll move on to look at adding code to control the way that the user form allows interaction with the user. Applying attributes such as font and text color to the user form itself allows you to change the default attributes of all form controls that you subsequently create. The locked property is used to prevent a user from changing the value of a control. To create a multi-line text box, as well as making the control several lines deep, the multi-line property must be set to true. The value property can be used to set a default value for text boxes, combo boxes, and spin buttons. To activate a checkbox or option button by default, set its value property to true. The group name property is used to ensure that each set of option buttons created on a form behaves as a distinct group.